Hi you guys, hello and welcome. I hope you guys are all doing really well. I wanted to make a very general idea on clematis because there's so many beautiful clematises out there. So there's two varieties I'm gonna focus on today. There's one back there that's called Wisely. It's in the Viticella group, and then there's another one over here which is called Miss Spencer Castle. So I just want to give you guys some tips on how to grow really wonderful clematis. Things that have worked for me. I have a couple more clematises back there and another one back there, but they're not in bloom yet. I'll get a little bit more into bloom times a little bit later. But I just wanted to show you what's in bloom now. So this one here is Lady Spencer. Really beautiful double jackmanii variety. Or sorry, not jackmanii, it's a Montagnier variety. And another neat thing about clematis is they always have this hook, so that's an identification feature. This is kind of my pride and joy of clematis over here. This one here is Wisely. It's part of the Viticella group, which I'll get into a little bit later. And it's just blooming really nicely for me. It goes all the way back there, but it's kind of covered in raspberries right now. Excuse me. So I think I didn't really plan this video. I just kind of came up with the idea right now because I'm out here in the rain, and honestly the rain's my favorite weather. I know that sounds kind of weird, but can't get enough of the rain. Maybe it's because I'm from British Columbia, but it rains here a lot. I really love it. It's really fresh. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about classifications. So clematises come in 3 different pruning classifications. So you have group 1, group 2, and group 3. Generally speaking, the vast majority of clematis are in group 2, and the differences are that group 1 clematises always bloom off of old wood, group 2 clematises bloom off of old and new wood, and then group 3 clematises bloom exclusively on new wood. I really hope I got that right. If I got anything wrong there, I'll put it in the description below. But they're also classified by blooms. So there's bloom types. You have Montagnier clematis, you have Viticella clematis, and then you have a whole other ones. You have Lanceifolia clematis. This one's Viticella, which means that it's a larger blooming clematis. And you also have smaller blooming clematises. You have cupped clematises, you have star-shaped clematises, and you have prostrate, upward-facing clematis too. So another thing I want to say about these guys is some of them are herbaceous and some of them are highly woody. You'll generally figure that out if the new growth has this kind of coppery color. Generally speaking, that means it's a woody clematis. If this here persists as a green sort of lime color in the first year, then it's generally speaking herbaceous. The vast majority of herbaceous clematis love to be cut right back down to the ground. And yeah, so they're also divided in group A, B, and C. I know it gets a little bit confusing, but group A clematises are clematis that bloom just exclusively in the spring. Typically speaking, these are the clematises that you want to prune back by about half after they're done blooming to encourage more shoots, so you have more shoots to get blooms on in the following year. And then you have group B clematises. Those ones are the ones that bloom in the early spring and once again in the fall. Sorry, in the summer. And then you have group C clematis, which bloom continuously in these profuse plumes, but usually they require pruning of about a quarter of the plant in between bloom periods. So yes, that's a lot to absorb. Feel free to rewind if you need to. It's a lot of different classifications. But anyways, so I'll give you guys 5 tips on how to grow clematis. My first tip, and I think this is arguably one of the most important things in growing all clematis varieties, is they like for their roots to be cold, and they like for their top parts, their leaves, and their blooms to be really quite warm. This is easily accomplished if you cover the bottom part in some other sort of perennial or large leaf foliage, and then keep the top exposed to pretty well full sun. I'm not sure why, but clematises are like this in that they really like to have their roots cold. So here, that's why I have the raspberries and then I have it growing on top. General rule of thumb, pretty well universally across all clematis, you want to keep the top warm and the bottom cool. And I don't mean too cool, I mean approximately 8 to 10 degrees Celsius is a good soil target. for the summer so that you don't completely overwhelm them. Another thing I want to say is to get really, really big blooms on your clematis. Highly recommend feeding them as soon as you see them start to leaf out. Leafing out usually happens in late March here in British Columbia. That'll be different for you down in the southern hemisphere. It'll be more like September-ish. And if you feed them with especially a high phosphorus fertilizer, they tend to really like that. So in all fertilizers, you have three numbers. You have NPK, which stand for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Try to locate a fertilizer that has a high middle number, and that should encourage some more blooms on your clematis because it starts from the root system and it helps them beef up a little bit. You can definitely root cuttings of clematis, but just make sure that you have a couple of nodes. So this is what I meant by a node. You want to make sure that you leave at least two if you're going to make cuttings. I highly recommend rooting hormone, just because they don't tend to root very readily. And that way you get blooms more easily, because a lot of them will bloom on only second year wood, as I talked before in groups 1, 2, and 3, which is really confusing. Please just bear with me. So a little bit more on the history of clematis. They've been hybridized all over the world, namely in the UK. The original clematis were a lot less showy. They typically had about 4 petals to a flower. They were a lot more stocky and lanky. The blooms themselves were a little bit more small, and they were native to Japan. A lot of them specifically southern coastal areas of Japan, and since then we've had so many different hybrids. So, another thing I want to say is if you want to avoid rust in clematis are so susceptible to rust. You just want to make sure that you keep them in areas that are well ventilated, and you want to ensure that you don't plant them too close to, I know this sounds a little counterintuitive, but if you plant them too close to many other clematis plants, they tend to sort of create this area of highly susceptible plants, and then the pests tend to get in. You tend to get lots of bacterial infections, so I don't recommend planting too many clematises next to each other unless you have a similar variety. I don't know why that works that way, it just kind of does. What's another thing I should say? I'm sure I'm going to miss out a lot in this video, you guys. I'm sorry, this is just very spontaneous, but I really thought I needed to make a video on this. If you want to make your clematis blooms last a little bit longer, if you have them in containers, you can put them in a slightly shaded location, which seems a little counterintuitive because they do require full sun to initiate those blooms, so you'll get so many more blooms if you have them in full sun. But once they open, you kind of want to shade them a little bit. And I say that because they do sort of become green. They antique a little bit, and they get a little bit of fasciation, and then they start to photosynthesize. And then you lose your leaves a lot earlier if they're in complete direct sunlight all the time. Another thing I want to say is if you're saving your seeds to grow future clematis, be very mindful of birds. Lots of birds, namely jays and robins, like plucking the really kind of feathery, they look almost like a truffula from Dr. Seuss style seeds. They're achenes, so they're very aerodynamic seeds. And yeah, so another thing I want to say is be mindful of how your plant overwinters. So generally speaking, all clematis are about -15 degrees Celsius as far as hardiness goes. They can take a hard frost, but you definitely want to protect them in their first season or two before they start getting into maturity. And that's very easily accomplished by putting a layer of about 2 to 3 inches of straw over top of the soil surface if you're growing them outdoors. If you're growing them in containers, just to put a little bit more topsoil. A couple of inches will be fine, just to make sure that they don't freeze to death, basically, because that can happen. Now, just trying to think of another tip with clematis. You want to give them something to climb up. If you don't give them anything to climb up, you'll generally speaking get smaller blooms, and they tend to just not be as lustrous, and they tend to not open up as full. So this one here was just in an area that didn't have any climbing potential to it, and then this was right on my trellis. Notice how much bigger that is? Yeah, look at that. That's beautiful. Looks almost glow in the dark. um, I'm sounding very long-winded in this video. Oh my gosh, I hope this isn't too long. Another thing I want to say about clematis is they like really good drainage. If they stick in water for way too long, you tend to get a lot of dieback. You tend to get a less vigorous plant because it doesn't have that full root system because it's constantly sitting on this water bed. Its roots don't penetrate very deep down into the soil, and then you don't get a very nice root system. Another thing I want to say about many clematis varieties, it's quite common in the jackmanii variety, is they are quite strongly rooted, so you want to watch out if you're putting them next to like hardscapes or pavement. They could potentially crack it. And yeah, so just be mindful of the variety you have, how big it gets, its bloom time, its bloom size, its pruning group, another very important thing, and when it blooms, and its cold hardiness. A lot of them uh, somewhat weirdly like temperatures around 33 degrees Celsius on the top part, and then the bottom, as I said earlier, to be 8 to 12 degrees much cooler. Generally speaking, clematis are, I would say, about a 4 or 5 out of 10 on the hard to grow scale. On a scale of 1 to 10, I've certainly killed a couple of them in my day, but they tend to get much better and much more low maintenance as you go along. They're a lot harder to grow in containers. They don't transplant very well unless you're growing them from cuttings. Generally speaking, they don't transplant very well. Recommend planting them as soon as you get them from the store. So many varieties to choose from, you guys. And yeah, some of these are like dinner plate size. Like, I don't think I have a particularly large head, but you get a bit of a scale. I mean, kind of the size of my hand. So yeah, that was a really super chill video. I just kind of talked the whole time, so sorry about that, I guess. Um, but I really hope you learned something from this, and excuse me, definitely want to keep clematis well watered when it gets too hot. They don't like to dry out bone dry. They like to dry out a little bit, but definitely not bone dry. That tends to give you yellow and brown crispy leaves, which is not very aesthetically pleasing. And definitely grow them on walls. It looks really nice. They don't have like prop roots or anything that really damages the walls. It's just they grow with these woody tendrils. It's no big deal. And yeah, general rule of thumb, if you're not sure when to prune it or what variety, I can't speak, sorry, variety it is, I highly recommend pruning right after the first flush of blooms within the year. I think that's a good rule of thumb because then you're not killing any of the blooms and you give it enough time before the winter sets in for it to regrow. Yeah, highly recommend woody varieties over herbaceous varieties too, because it's very easy to forget where you put the herbaceous ones and you can bury them with other stuff. They're somewhat invasive in some areas. That's another thing I will say. They naturalize incredibly well. And yeah, there's well over 350 varieties of clematis. Vast majority of them are in cooler colors, but there are a few yellow and reds too, but most of them are lilacs and whites and creams and beigey blues, and there's even interesting taupe colors. Just a really beautiful selection. You can even get double and triple bloom ones too. And yeah, I've had quite a few comments on mint plants, so I might make a follow-up video on that. I got some mint growing up here. I got some more mint over there, so I might make a video on that later. At this point, I'm just planning out loud, so sorry about that. But yeah, have a wonderful day, stay blessed, and enjoy yourselves, guys. Stay healthy. That's kind of how the garden's doing right now. I got some huge hostas. I don't know if you guys can see over there. Where is it? Over there, I got a really big hosta. Okay, stay blessed. I'll stop talking.